With that, I will introduce Adena. Adena Rissman is professor at the PI Lab, which stands for People, Institutions, and Ecosystems at UW-Madison. She is professor of the human dimensions of ecosystem management. She works to understand the people and policies that influence working lands, agriculture, and conservation. Thank you very much, Adena, for being here today.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. And thanks. We've got such a great group with us today of a lot of familiar faces and many I hope to meet in the future. So thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. Today, I'm going to be talking about developing channels for proactive landowner engagement. And I wanted to just start with introducing a little bit about the PI Lab. The PI Lab stands for People, Institutions, and Ecosystems, and we investigate the relationships among them and focusing on, in particular, natural resources, conservation, and sustainable agriculture. So I wanted to hear a little bit about who's with us today. And so if everybody could just share into the chat box a little bit about who you are, maybe you want to say your title or how you came to be here today. And that'll just help me have a sense of who's with us in the room. Great, so lots of folks from university, from Fish and Wildlife Service, prairie enthusiasts, Kickapoo, Mississippi Valley Conservancy, NRCS, DNR, fantastic, Xerxes Society, and Extension. Thanks everybody who shared into the chat. That's great to just get a sense of our group today. And lots of folks coming to this work from many different perspectives. So today I'm going to give an overview and then talk about two different projects, the New Landowner Project and the Grassland 2.0 project. So as a bit of an overview, as you know, this is a highly private lands oriented landscape. This is a map that shows public lands in green and lands that are protected through mostly conservation easements by private holders are in red. And it doesn't necessarily show every conservation easement. There's certainly some that are not here, but as we can see, there's a lot of private land in this landscape. And why does that matter? Well, as I don't have to tell most of you today on this talk, but I think is always helpful to get an overview of, private lands provide many important resources and services, both for the individual private landowner, as well as what we might call public benefits or public goods. And here's a schema of ecosystem services that are provided, which is kind of a different way of just saying benefits from nature. And many people have worked to try to understand and depict all these benefits that nature provides. And these are the benefits that private lands provide on the landscape. So these are things like food and wood. These are provisioning services, things that provide services directly to us. Also things like bioenergy, food and fiber production. Then there's regulating services, things that nature does that help regulate the environment that we live in, like filtering water, decomposing waste, pollinating crops. And as we're seeing more and more of, or wishing for more of, disease control, nature does play a role in that as well. Cultural services, aesthetics, spiritual, personal growth, and mental health as well. So a lot of different benefits that private lands provide. And I had a landowner one time after a talk tell me, I always just thought of my land as my land before and hadn't really thought about how it connects to these broader benefits that are provided for neighbors and for society as a whole. And I think that's one of the critical messages that many of our organizations share. So I want to talk next about some of the tools for engaging landowners. And here I thought I would provide some overview slides from an organization called Telly, or tools that provides these tools for engaging landowners effectively. And I've given the website address here if you're interested in learning more about their approach. Here are some of their basic messages. Be clear about what you want people to do after receiving your message. If you're trying to communicate for behavior change, often we may come from a place of just raising awareness, but the folks who really study behavior change tell us that raising awareness isn't enough. We have to have a clear plan for what are the behaviors we want people to change as a result of what they're learning or seeing in a different way. Designing outreach for specific types of landowners. There's many different kinds of people in the world, and different messages resonate, and different motivators might be more effective than others for changing behavior. And also taking the audience's perspective, listening to the target audience, or including participants from your audience as leaders in increasing buy-in into the program. Other strategies include solving their problems and speaking their language, connecting around shared values, and a few other ideas they mentioned include trying to make 1 or 2 points and not a long list. That can be hard for those of us in academia, like our long list of things, but try to really focus around 1 or 2, be realistic, and make that message heard multiple times. When we think about the kinds of approaches that agencies are taking to engaging private landowners, I wanted to provide this example. This is actually a DNR forestry example, and this graphic comes out of the Wisconsin Forest Action Plan that shows this funnel. At the larger scale, they're interested in broad outreach appeals to reach a large number of landowners. From that, maybe a smaller pool of people would cultivate connections or take a first step toward engagement. And then an even smaller number might actually implement something on the ground. And, it strikes me that there isn't a statewide grasslands plan or managed grazing plan, but there, I think, are lessons that we can take from so let's say the Forest Action Plan around thinking at these larger scales about how to direct our activity for landowners. When we think about the factors that may influence private landowner choices, there's a huge literature on this. And many of the things that people point to are both internal, things about that person, their attitudes, how they perceive social norms, which are really how they think others expect them to act, and their perceived self-efficacy. Do they think they will be effective? This is sort of the I think I can kind of mindset of, if you think you can do something, you're more likely to do it. And if you think you're going to be effective, you're more likely to try. As well as a lot of capacity influences, finances, information, support networks, time. And then a number of factors that are external to that person, the markets, the demographics, as we've heard about in the last session, as well as different government policies and a lot of other external effects. So this can all influence the choices that private landowners make. And then once they've made that choice, there's a variety of different effects that choice can have. These can include a decision to adopt a program, to change a behavior or management practice on the ground. And these can then have different kinds of outcomes, social, environmental, economic kinds of outcomes. Now I want to show a little bit of a different diagram that talks about some of these same ideas, but from a even larger kind of systems perspective, in which you can see that farmer or that landowner is in the middle. They may be providing goods to a consumer and affected by markets. And we could think about these both in terms of agricultural markets, but also land markets. And they're going to be affected by a lot of things in what people call the social ecological system, environmental conditions, resources, as well as the socio-technological system in things like technology, mechanization, the kinds of farm equipment, and a lot of institutions. And these become really important when we ask people to make a change, or when we think about how can we make change in broader agricultural and land use systems. And then third at the bottom, norms and networks, and how people may be perceiving these social norms, and how they may be influenced by information or by expectations from others. There's another big picture framework that I just wanted to share. And that comes from a really interesting paper. So I want to now go back to the chat box to say, what does landowner engagement mean to you? What does an engaged landowner look like? What do you think are some of the goals of that engagement? So go ahead and just take a minute. You could think about it, and then when you're ready, go ahead and chat that into the chat box. Thanks. And there's, I just want to encourage everyone not to be shy. There's no right or wrong answer on this. You know, this is just a brainstorm to get us going here. And now that I'm back in my chat box, I see a few other check-ins from my first question about who's in the room. So thanks, welcome everybody. So from Randy, thanks. Dialogue and shared experiences. Kristen, desire to learn, even if they aren't ready for the next step. So kind of an openness to learning. Values, very important. Learning, shared objectives, inclination of land stewardship, and are either at the point of doing work on their own or turning to programs. Somebody who implements, thanks Caitlin, someone who implements conservation and understands conservation. Heidi, a landowner that uses best management practices and then helps spread that knowledge to others. So someone who also becomes a leader and a source of information. Mike, a landowner investing time, energy, and maybe funds into improving their land for their goals. At least, Tony thinks, at least communication, discussing and listening, thinking through their goals and objectives, really being clear about those, and having the desire to try something new, learning and being engaged. And Andy, awareness of the DNR's conservation goals and mission and how a landowner's actions intersect with those. Great, thanks everybody. Lots of great ideas here that span really the range from, and I would say the bulk of these are focused on landowners' openness, their communication, their learning, and a few people also really talking about behavior change specifically. And also going that process of being able to set goals, having, as Brenna mentions, a long-term commitment to goals. And Diane as well, focusing on communications over time, listening to their goals, stories, ideas, and vice versa, really that two-way engagement. Great, well, thanks everyone. And Rodney adding trust to that mix. You know, a landowner who trusts us enough to talk about their goals and plans. Yeah, thank you. So next I want to talk through a project that I am working on with Tony, who's in the room, and others, that is about new landowners and landowner turnover, and how and whether that presents a moment of opportunity for outreach and engagement. And engagement, I think, meaning many of the things that we've talked about, both goal setting, communication, learning, behavior change, and then becoming a resource and kind of leader for others. So I want to share a little bit about this project. We call it the Conservation and Succession Success, or New Landowner Project is what we usually call it. And this project has a number of goals, mainly to support decision-making by new landowners and the organizations that work with them. And we do have a focus on new landowners in general and those with land and conservation easements or other existing conservation agreements that run with the land. We're looking at understanding spatial and temporal trends in rural land transfers, and this is some of the results, initial results that I will share today, and starting to think about some of the types and timing of information that would best help new landowners make sound land management decisions. Here we are thinking about gender and race as well, and developing and testing welcoming outreach. That's a future step that we haven't got into yet. And we're very blessed to have a fantastic advisory group that includes landowners, government, private consultants, nonprofit staff. So one of the big trends that we've been hearing about is land ownership change and the graying of landowners and this increasing turnover in land. And so we wanted to look at some of this for Wisconsin. So these are some results that my graduate student Tierney Boxey has been working up, and shows some of the trends in rural land transfer. So this is statewide data from Wisconsin that is on lands for 5 acres or more. So we're finding that there are a number of land transfers, and this is data since 2015, mostly in that very small range, and many that are, again, in that 14 to 18 hectares. Sorry, these are in hectares. We have to convert them back to make them more clear. But the majority are being smaller parcels that are changing hands, and then another bump or pulse in that larger size, around 40 acres. We looked at this by land cover, and we do see that there's a lot of, this is the average size of the parcel. And so we do see crop and forest being larger than grass or shrub properties. And how this is defined is what is the dominant land cover on that property. And so the grassland properties did tend to be smaller than cropland and forestland properties. We also had a category called mixed, where if a property had 2 or more that of a sizable portion of their land, then we classified them as mixed. When we looked at gender, this was interesting because we haven't seen a lot of people using this method. We looked at the gender of names from the parcel data, and these are real estate transfer records as well. And so often they'll list people's first names. Not always. There's a decent number of unknown properties that where there's an LLC and there isn't a first name. But based on Social Security Administration data, we're able to calculate an estimate, at least, of the gender of a person with a certain first name. And so we do see that lands held by men do tend to be larger. This is the total area in each land cover type. So the majority are held by men without a woman on the property or unknown. Those are the 2 columns farther to the right. And then followed by both, where there may be a male and a female name, and then a smaller proportion held by women, but still substantial, women only without a male name on that property. This is data that we're really just getting into. So if you have questions and are thinking, hey, run it this way or run it for this subregion of the state, let me know, and we will try to answer those questions as well. So those are a few of the things that we've been learning about some of the trends in land transfer. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the timeline within a transfer and what those landowner needs are and how they may be engaging with professional assistance. And we definitely see important differences before and after that land transfer. So before a land transfer, there is obviously, for a purchase, a lot of focus on land selection. And for somebody who may be gifting or granting that land, the choice of who to grant that land to. We do see an emphasis on finances right away, often because landowners may need money for that down payment or to pay that tax bill, or for other things that they may want or need on that land, like equipment. And then afterwards, there's a lot of different goals that come into play, whether it's a farm business, whether it's for recreation, where people want a deer food plot or want to create a new prairie. And other landowners don't want to take action right away, kind of prefer to wait, enjoy the land, get to know things, and their goals may not require them to take that kind of immediate action. And one of the things that we have heard is that some early investments and choices may lock in pathways. When we think about engagement with professional assistance, before a land transfer, there's many different kinds of professionals that may be contacted, but very few of them are often natural resources or conservation professionals. People like realtors, county or municipal permitting, title searches. But afterwards, there can be a lot of varied engagement with professional and peer networks, from foresters to biologists, consultants, extension agents, and lots of different kinds of opportunities. Now, certainly some people are engaging with many of these resources beforehand, but often they can't really get professional advice about a particular property until they've purchased it. Some of the stories that we heard asking people, doing interviews with new landowners or professionals who work with new landowners, some of the things that we heard were particular challenges around prairie restoration. Prairie restoration is just hard to do. There are a lot of very time-consuming steps, as well as a lot of ways that it could potentially go wrong is something that we heard. And so landowners who, let's say, planted the wrong seed mix or didn't fully prep the site were, having to kind of backtrack, especially in that initial conversion of, let's say, corn to prairie. And so that seems to be a place where really early intervention could be very helpful. I was looking at the chat for a question from Kristen, what the change in landowner engagement is from the prior to the new landowner, and are the new landowners more or less or about the same in terms of conservation engagement? That's really interesting, Kristen, because we don't have an answer to that right now, but I think that would be really neat to be able to survey both the prior owner as well as the new owner of land. And I'd have to think through whether we'd always have the contact information to be able to do that. But yeah, I think that'd be really interesting. Thanks for your question. And I guess one other thing about that question is when we think about, let's say, people who place a conservation easement or agree to some kind of conservation, whether it's easement or other kind of agreement or lease, that we definitely see that a second generation landowner may not have exactly the same kinds of conservation goals, or they may not play out in the same way. So I think that's definitely one of the big pieces of interest of this project is how do those new owners kind of deal with a conservation agreement or something else that may be in place that they maybe didn't sign up for initially. And yeah, so I think that's an important part of understanding that. And one thing that's really come up is this complex organizational landscape. And this is something we heard from our advisory board members. There's a lot of different organizations with a lot of different kinds of expertise. And one person said, when we send landowners in all different directions for the information, they can sometimes give up. Landowners are busy, and there's a lot of different kinds of pieces to chase down to figure out all the different kinds of programs that are available. And one landowner said to us, if I could have a team that could look at the farm as a whole, that would probably be beneficial, rather than the forester comes out and looks at this part and USDA comes out and looks at these acres that make it into prairie. Having that team approach seems to many people like beneficial, but would also be more coordination for folks to do, and questions around who would pay for it. But I think many people, this is a conversation I'm hearing a lot, is many people are trying to think about this question of coordination and the complex networks for private lands. We did in some of our interviews, and we've interviewed, I think about 20 professionals in Wisconsin now who work with private landowners. And, many people were able to speak. I would say some people were able to speak really in depth about barriers to women as landowners and the experiences of women landowners. But these did tend to be folks who really have spent a lot of time with women caring for the land and other learning circles approaches. Many interviewees really kind of didn't have a ton to say and defaulted to things like, well, it's societal challenges or something broad. In terms of barriers to women landowners. We did hear about wage disparities and just finances in general. Women can be busy with full-time careers and parenting. And some people mentioned gender norms, that some were reaching out on behalf of their husband, while others were very comfortable seeking information directly. So gender is certainly a place where there's been a lot of activity and many grants to improve the situation for women landowners. And, you know, I think that's something that will continue. And finally, landowners
I'm just going
to color.
A little over 5 minutes.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, okay, thanks. In terms of landowners of color, many professionals could not really think of any Wisconsin landowners of color they had worked with, except for tribes. And didn't really seem comfortable talking about it. So that was something else that came up. So I think given the time, you know, I want to pose this question, but I don't think we'll have a ton of time to answer it. Does land transfer create a window of opportunity for conservation or outreach to landowners who are selling or buying? Yeah, and Kurt, thanks for your comment in the chat about coordination. Cindy Becker's been a great part of our advisory board, and it's been really exciting to see the work that she's done in the Southwest Driftless area to connect landowners with the right practitioners and help do that coordination. Finally, with this project, we have a plan to send 250 landowner postcards and to do interviews. We'll then be developing a lot of outreach information and then also doing quantitative surveys. So that's what's left for this project. I finally want to talk about, with too little time for a really enormous and exciting project, but I want to talk about the Grassland 2.0 project. I do lead the policy and governance team for it, and the Grassland 2.0 project is really thinking about transitions to manage grazing and grasslands across the upper Midwest. And in the policy team, we are thinking about conducting research on these transitions to grazing, leverage points for policy and behavior change. We'll be doing farmer surveys, lots of interviews, developing an online clearinghouse of existing policy materials, and sharing the stories of innovators. And I want to share just a little bit of information so far. These are some of the Census of Agriculture data on the decline in pasture. This is non-woodland pasture. Wisconsin's in orange there and has lost 800,000 acres of non-woodland pasture in the last 20 years, according to the census data. And this has really been true of all these other states in the upper Midwest as well. When we think about some of the factors that are influencing grazers, one person told us, "I'm very thankful that I'm able to keep my mind open because there was a lot of pressure from other farmers that I knew, like, really, are you going to be a grazer?" So, you know, thinking about these norms. And then an external factor, thinking about financial incentives. Well, you get more of what you pay for. If you don't pay enough for something, you wind up with less of it. And I think we see that with pasture. And that's something that we've also been collecting the data on, just the vast farm bill funds for row crops versus for pasture and grasslands. When we look at NRCS number of acres that go into prescribed grazing practice, we do see a decline mid 2000s and then fairly consistent after that. And so final discussion question, what approaches can engage landowners to prevent conversion of pasture and grasslands and encourage transitions to grazing and grasslands? So I'd go ahead and throw that one. That's kind of a big question, but let's just go ahead and take our remaining time to throw that in the chat as well.
Dina, while they're doing that, there was one other question from Heidi, wondering if you are starting to see an increasing trend in land ownership of women 65 plus, saying that we maybe should be marketing conservation to women. And often they tend to be more open to new ways of managing the land.
Yeah, thanks Heidi for that question. And thanks for pointing it out to me. You know, the data that we have from real estate transfers doesn't give us people's age, but that would be something that we should dig into more from agricultural census data to be able to look at that. We definitely are seeing that pattern of transfers from couples to like one member of the couple, which would often be a widow or widower, and with women more likely to live longer than men, that certainly is something that's really important. I think one of the things that comes up is that, you know, for people who have just lost their husband, or, you know, at that time of life, that it both is an important time to be able to be providing that support. But many of people have said it'd be great if that support had started earlier as well. So you're not kind of waiting for that moment to provide that support. So yeah, I'd be really curious if others' perspectives on this, but I think that is something that is really important. And as you mentioned, in surveys, women do report a higher sense of, you know, interest in the wildlife value of land or environmental benefits over a financial benefit of land. But it's certainly not exclusive, but slightly more in surveys. Yeah. Yeah, and thanks, Mike, for your point about the Iowa study about widows who own land. It's certainly important for sure. Yeah, so I'm seeing in terms of responses on this last question, definitely thinking about the finances of row crops and preventing conversion being a tough one. Thanks, Katie, for coming on that, when they can get a lot more money renting for row crops, and the need that Mike mentioned to show those net benefits despite less income. And, you know, I know through the Grassland 2.0 project, there's a lot of people thinking about markets for environmental benefits and services that might come out as well to help try to change that financial calculus. And Heidi, yeah, working with groups at a younger age. Thanks for that. I'll just end with a bunch of acknowledgements for my many collaborators. I know Randy Jackson is here on the line, and Anna Fukasato, Tony, thanks for being here, Aaron Green, Laura Payne, also a partner on the Grassland 2.0 project, and many others. So thanks so much. And thanks everybody for being here. And yeah, happy to stick around, but I know that we're at our time. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adena. Thanks everybody for joining us. The last final session, the Southern Driftless Grasslands accomplishments and actions, will start in about 5 minutes. So we can take a break now, or if you want to stick around and ask questions, feel free as well.
Great, thanks so much. And Tony, see your comment in the chat. Assistance programs that fit these producers with NRCS and DNR. Yeah, very important. Thanks. Feel free to turn on your mics and, you know, shout out if there's something else you want to add. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.
I'm not seeing any more chats or anything. Sounds like people are kind of slowly slipping away. So
yeah, that sounds good. And it's good to take a break before the final session. So thanks.
Yeah, just a quick break. And thanks so much. That was great. It was really
good. Yeah.